Hey, happy Monday. So, picking back up where we've left off in our study of James, we're starting in chapter 2. And so, just want to go over a few things that stand out to me that I noticed as I was reading through and talking it over with my wife. And when you get into chapter 2, right? So James starts talking about showing partiality, about showing favoritism to one person versus another based on our appearances or our perceptions. And interestingly enough, when he says in verse 8, he says, "If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, which is you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality," right? And so he's setting up these two ideas as kind of opposing arguments or a contrast one to the other. And so to demonstrate the love of God and to really live out the quality of love and the fulfillment of that commandment, which is to love others as we love ourselves, it excludes partiality or showing favoritism. And so I started thinking to myself, well, how does that bear itself out in our lives, right? And as I consider this, right, it's hard to think of an obvious situation where it's like, man, I was definitely showing obvious favoritism, right? Because, that's not something we would necessarily be aware of. But more importantly, right, it probably plays out more subconsciously. Do I have the same attitude of love and care for everybody, right? When it comes to who am I willing to approach and conversate to? Who would I consider sharing the gospel with, right? And, there's lots of opportunities where this probably is playing out subconsciously without us really even realizing it. So that's something that I really feel like I needed to give more consideration to and attention to, is making sure that I'm not kind of doing this unknowingly in my behaviors and in my circle of friends, right? Who do I pursue as friends versus who do I choose not to? Even if it's not an intentional choose not to, I'm just choosing not to still, right? So something to consider. But then also as he closes out this section going through verse 13, he talks about whoever shall keep the whole law and yet sin or stumble in one part is guilty of all, right? And so this really speaks to the idea of self-righteousness, or people kind of wrongly judging themselves, where I think, and this can be true of anybody, it's certainly been true of me over the years, where I've kind of let myself off the hook because I'm not as bad as that person, or, I don't consider the things or the sins that I do, as seriously as they really ought to be considered. And the truth is, if we think back to the garden with Adam and Eve, right, all it took was one act of disobedience to create that separation between them and God. And so as we get further into James here, we're going to get into this idea about faith a little bit more, but recognizing that all it takes to be separated from God is one sin. And although we in our human realm, we have certain sins that we deem as more severe or more consequential or more damaging in human relationships, ultimately any sin before God is separating us from him, and requires to have that forgiven and have that reconciliation brought from Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, and then us putting our faith in that and not in ourselves, right? And so this idea I think James is framing is that when we show partiality, we're sinning, right? And although we might be inclined to think, well, that's not that big of a deal, James is emphasizing that it's just as big a deal as any other sin in terms of our relationship with God. So just something to consider as, we working through this, maybe do some reflection on how am I living out the love of God in the way that I interact with people, and am I loving everybody and demonstrating the love of God to everybody the way that I should? And in the areas where I'm struggling to live out the love of God, do I recognize and understand the significance of it and the importance of rectifying those situations in those areas of my life where I need to fix? So anyways, a couple of thoughts there from the beginning of chapter 2 of James. Looking forward to getting into the next video. The next video, we're going to be diving into the faith without works is dead passage, which is probably one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented passages in the Bible. So I'm really excited about covering that one in my next video. Hope you have a great night. Take care.